Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Downs with Sleep Balance Academy, and I'm in New York now at the Air Institute meeting. I'm going to record this webinar on nitric oxide in the human body and also the nitrogen cycle in nature and how they relate. Let me go ahead and share my screen if you'll hold on a moment. Okay. The nitrogen cycle. We're going to talk about nitrogen cycle and the nitric oxide cycle in the human body. I'm going to particularly focus on the enterosalivary system and considerations on nitric oxide production in the nose. We're talking about this because nitric oxide is an important part of nasal breathing. If I have time, we'll go into other oxidative systems, but nitrogen oxide is an oxidating agent as well as a reducer. Let me go through the next slide here. I'm going to disclosure. I'm Dr. Richard Downs. I'm co-founder of OraCare Products Company, and we make an oral mouth rinse, and we also make a gel and an implant retention product. We're developing a toothpaste and a number of other products based around oxidative therapies. I want to show you this little nitrogen cycle video. I'm going to narrate it because the YouTube video doesn't show up or it doesn't record very well as far as the audio is concerned. Therefore, I can do this and make sure that you can understand what they're talking about. So hold on a moment. Okay, today we're going to learn about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is an odorless, colorless element, and it composes about 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is very important to life. All living things find nitrogen necessary to be able to survive. It is necessary for our food as well. It is necessary for living things, but too much nitrogen can harm the environment. Plants and animals cannot absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere. So while there's plenty in the air, they need different ways to access it. They need to process it and help the nitrogen out of the air and into the living organism. This is known as the nitrogen cycle. For nitrogen to be used by living organisms, it must change into different states. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is N2. Some other important states of nitrogen are ammonium, NH4, nitrates, NO3, and nitrite, NO2. Look closely here because bacteria plays a very important role in the nitrogen cycle. When nitrogen is absorbed by the soil, bacteria help it change to states that can be useful for plants. Animals eat the plants and then get their nitrogen from the plants. Let's see the steps in the process of making nitrogen usable. First is fixation. It's the first step in the process of making nitrogen usable by plants. Here, bacteria change nitrogen into the form of ammonium. Second is nitrification. Nitrification. In this process, ammonium gets changed into nitrates by bacteria. Nitrates are something that plants can absorb. Assimilation. This is how plants get their nitrogen. They absorb nitrates from the soil into the roots, and then the nitrogen is used to make nucleic acids, amino acids, chlorophyll. Ammonification. When a plant or animal dies, decomposes, such as bacteria, like fungi and bacteria, nitrogens turn back into ammonium From here, it re-enters the nitrogen cycle. Denitrification. Extra nitrogen in the soil gets put back out into the atmosphere, and bacteria like Hyobacillus denitrificans and other species, and like Pseudomonas, are implicated as denitrifiers. This is the whole process of the nitrogen cycle. So human activity has badly affected the nitrogen cycle. Humans do this by adding too much nitrogen to the soil with fertilizers, such as more nitrogen than is needed in the soil. I know the video went long. I went longer than the video, so I'm going to stop that right now. The ads. Hold on just a moment. So if you saw from that video, nature uses bacteria to produce a usable nitrogen, and humans do the same thing, especially in areas like the intestine and the tongue. So I'm going to say some shocking statements that may puzzle you, and I'm going to try to support and maintain what I've said here. Okay. Rinsing with antimicrobial mouth rinse can lower the blood pressure and balance your oral microbiome. Now, you may have heard the opposite, that antimicrobials raise your blood pressure. So let's go ahead and I'll support this statement later on. Snoring helps infuse the lungs with nitric oxide, which is good for you. You've always heard that snoring is bad for you, right? Well, there might be one instance where it might be good for you. Bad breath lowers blood pressure. Ever heard that before? I'll explain that later. Hot dogs and bacon can be good for you. Imagine that. Green leafy vegetables in your diet will supply you with enough nitrates to exceed the World Health Organization recommended levels by 550%. Antioxidant supplements in the diet consistently show an increase in cancer rates and worsening of cancer conditions. So I'm going to go ahead and explore some of those statements as we go through this. There's a lot of bandwagon marketing going on in nitric oxide supplements. You'll see people promoting them, and there are literally many ways that you could promote nitric oxide production in the body, and that might be a good thing. Here's one that a friend of mine shared with me. This particular product just contains vitamin C and magnesium. Oh, now they do have some nitric oxide promoting activities in the body. I think that they're really overhyping this one here. Okay. So to support them, though, I'd say that vitamin C may help with nitrosamines and nitrosamides. In other words, nitrosamines and nitrosamides are cancer-producing substances that nitrates can produce in your body. If nitrates are put on, for instance, bacon or sausages, they can combine with the amines there and produce nitrosamines. It's not necessarily the best form of nitrates that we want, but your body actually makes nitrosamines anyway, so you can't completely eliminate it. It's a matter of how much. Nitrates are inherently present in all plant materials, especially vegetables and forage crops and beer. The interest in nitrate consumption is due to the subsequent conversion of nitrates to nitrites, which are of greater concern in the formation of nitroso compounds. The endogenous conversion of nitrate to nitrite is a significant source of exposure to nitrites. However, nitrate intake in conjunction with vitamin C and possibly E may inhibit endogenous nitrosamine formation. So that's not a bad thing, okay? And that comes from this particular citation right here. So the current thoughts on mouth rinse effects on tongue commensal bacteria Studies related to this subject have been used to condemn all antimicrobial mouth rinses, and we're going to go over that and talked about the different types of mouth rinses. Most of the key opinion leaders' comments on the subject have fallen into what I call the scorched earth evangelist category. And I can tell you how it affected me. It was unexpected to hear key opinion leaders say things like this. I would expect key opinion leaders to be more discerning and not just repeating attention-grabbing sound bites. And why would I care? Good oral hygiene saves lives. Simple statement. Let's make a cool-headed view on these facts. Let's take a cool-headed look. So what do I mean by saying that they're scorched earth evangelists? Statements that come from people that say things like, I don't believe in killing all the bacteria in your mouth. The balance of the microbiome should be preserved. I don't believe in the scorched earth approach to therapy. I've heard this said by lecturers. Antimicrobial rinses raise your blood pressure, and they use a blanket global statements like this. So if something is popular and sounds like common sense, people will repeat it without inspection. For instance, Dr. Oz brought up that mouth rinses raise blood pressure on his show when the Texas study came on the scene a few years ago, and I'll show you that study that's been repeated by most people. And he said that mouth rinse study showed that mouth rinses can raise your blood pressure by 3 points. There's been an equal number of fringe supplement sellers like Stephen Grundy, MD, who have latched on to the latest mouth rinse study from Texas and now is a popular bandwagon citation. He evangelizes the dangers of mouth rinses destroying nitric oxide production as a bad hygiene practice, and instead he's touting pseudoscience like oil pulling. And this comes from this citation. And by the way, you can look at this YouTube show of him talking about it with a smug smile on his face. It comes from this article, Dr. Stephen Grundy, quack selling harmful supplements, and he wrote it in Newsworthy, and you can find that on grapeo.com. So do all mouth rinses raise blood pressure? Was the most recent study unflawed? Do other studies confirm the conclusions of that study? Are we going to abandon the wisdom of general hygiene learned over hundreds of years right now? I believe the answer to all these questions is no. So here's some revelations that you will realize by the end of this lecture. What? Almost all studies show only chlorhexidine raised blood pressure. You'll see that. And then there's the nuances that go on and that you need to understand. They're important nuances. Even chlorhexidine lowered blood pressure in certain hygiene practices. And no one knows why, not even the Texas study that I will show you. Sources of nitric oxide in the human body, and these are the ones that are most cited in the literature. Most of the nitric oxide is made by endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And these vascular forms include the endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, and the inducible or immune nitric oxide synthase. And then also in our tissues themselves, nitrites are actually converted into nitric oxide. Then there's a system called the extrinsic. I call it extrinsic. Nobody else has used that word, but I think you can safely say that there's an extrinsic system, and that's the enterosalivary system, where nitrates are converted to nitrites. And then the small intestine absorbs those nitrites into the bloodstream to be able to be formed into nitric oxide. As you can see, if you go from nitrate from nitrate to nitrites and into nitric oxide. These are consecutive steps. So here's a citation that I'd like you to look at: food sources of nitrates and nitrites, and it states that this is how the percentages kind of roll. The concentrations of plasma nitrate in the saliva of the enterosalivary circulation of dietary nitrate. Approximately 25% of ingested nitrate is secreted in saliva, where some 20% of that is of that nitric intake is converted into nitrite by commensal bacteria on the tongue. Then nitric oxide is absorbed in the intestines. I'm just going to summarize that a little bit. So you swallow the nitrates in your food, the green leafy vegetables, or some bacon, and where some 20% of that, 25% of that is ingested, is secreted in the saliva. It comes back to the mouth through the blood and through the saliva into the mouth. Once it enters the mouth through the saliva, the commensal bacteria on the tongue convert 20% of that, another 20% of the 25%, into nitrite. And then that nitrite is again absorbed in the intestine, about 100% of it actually, and goes into the bloodstream, where it then is converted into nitric oxide. But actually, nitrite itself has some of the nitric oxide properties, so this is good for you. Sources of nitric oxide are usually made from L-arginine by enzymes, and those three enzymes that I just mentioned before. 70% of our nitric oxide comes from these sources. Nitrates are also converted in the tissues to nitric oxide, as I mentioned before. And it also says in this article that endogenous production of nitric oxide is also adaptable. It increases in hypoxia. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of things that increase nitric oxide production in the body. It has an adaptable system, and our bodies are very adaptable for fluctuations in different sources of nitric oxide. This is important to know. I want you to know something called pleiotropism and redundancy, but let's talk a little bit now about the adaptability of the human being, and I'm going to go through two words here: pleiotropism and redundancy. And these two concepts exist all over the human body in many physiology systems. Cytokines, for instance, the pleiotropism means that a single entity or molecule can have multiple functions. It can do many different things, and it can go forward and backwards in its reaction with other elements in the body and molecules. Redundancy means that that two different cytokines can have the same function, so they have redundant abilities. And the same thing goes with nitric oxide and even the nitrites. So those things are existing in our human body. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you some citations now on mouth rinses and their effects on nitric oxide and the commensal bacteria of the tongue. Let's see what the literature says. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'm not an expert in nitric oxide, but I did read all the citations that they mentioned in the Texas study. We're going to talk about the literature, study design, what we know and what we don't know. Okay, so in the publication Sinusology from Jankowski, he says, nitric oxide plays the role of an aerocrine messenger between the upper and lower respiratory tracts, reducing pulmonary vascular resistance and facilitating alveolar oxygen transfer into the bloodstream. Its physiological role in arterial blood oxygenation could be involved in speech and singing or be activated by physiological snoring. Oh, did you see that? Snoring during sleep. So here's that surprising statement that I made earlier. Snoring can actually release nitric oxide from your sinuses. The nitric oxide that comes out of your sinuses into the respiratory tract comes out in little boli. And it happens with speech, but when you're speaking, and it can also happen during snoring. These vibratory acts release the nitric oxide. And you might think this is, the first thing that came to mind when I read this little fact was that maybe this is why women live longer than men, because they talk more. Just a humorous little side note there. Okay, in the nose, nitric oxide is continuously made in the sinuses without bacterial assistance, not like the mouth or the tongue. The cells there use cyclic guanosine monophosphate, cGMP, to produce that. cGMP is involved in tissue production as well. Here's another citation. The frequency of tongue cleaning impacts the human microbiome composition and the enterosalivary circulation of nitrate. This is the Frontiers of Cellular Microbiology, 1 March 2019. Now, remember that date, 1st of March 2019. I'll explain that a little bit later, why that is an important date in some of these studies, okay? Okay, in the study, the participants were screened for the Frontier study. This is the Texas study that most people are citing now for the nitric oxide impact from mouth rinses. So one thing they said was, as needed, they screened their participants and by the way, they had 26 participants in this study. So at most, it can be called a pilot study. As needed, mouthwash rinsing was allowed for these screened subjects. 5 participants, or 19%, used the rinse once per day. 16 participants, as needed, let's start over. About 5 participants used the mouth rinse as needed, there were 19%. 16 participants used it once a day, or 59%. 6 participants used mouthwash twice per day, for 22%. The ingredients of the mouth rinses being used were essential oils, 11, or 41%. Cetylpyridinium chloride, 10 participants, or 37%. And finally, the rest of them, or 6 participants, they didn't know what mouth rinse they were using, 22%. All right. So that's a surprising thing, that they would select participants who are already using antimicrobial mouth rinses. Don't you think that's unusual? I do. There were 26 participants in the study, as I mentioned before. In the study, they had the people rinse with 0.12% chlorhexidine gluconate and instructed to rinse with 1/2 ounce for 30 seconds twice a day as part of their normal hygiene in the morning and evening. Subjects were asked to discontinue the use of their other mouth rinses for the first 7 days. Okay, that's just the 7 days now. No periodontal disease was present, or pressures over 130, blood pressures over 130 were excluded. Many did tongue cleaning, but no distinctions was made between whether they brushed their tongue or they scraped their tongue. 23 cleaned daily their tongue, and 4 did so less than weekly. In other words, probably 4 of them didn't scrape at all. No criteria was used to screen toothpaste in this study, what toothpaste these people were using. Now, remember that March 1 date of that study? Well, Colgate removed triclosan from their toothpaste and their mouth rinses on February 2019, 1 month ahead of that. So what you're seeing then is that all of these participants could be using Colgate toothpaste with triclosan, and 4 of them, or maybe 6 of them, who gave no response on what rinse they were using, might have been using a mouth rinse with triclosan. Okay, all right, and that's been removed from the market. Colgate silently and secretly removed triclosan from their rinses and their toothpaste in February of 2019 without telling anybody, and they substituted acetylpyridinium chloride. Excuse me, they used stannous fluoride. Okay. So the study was published in March 1. So both of these antibacterial products could have been being used by these participants. There was no screening for sleep disorders either in any of these studies. We don't know if they were storing or they had high blood pressure contributing to their blood pressure or anything else that might have contributed to mouth breathing while they were sleeping or mouth breathing during the day. I don't know. We don't know if they had nasal obstructions at all. Not only is the microbiota personalized, okay, so now we're going to talk about the type of microbiota in each person's mouth, okay? And it's actually individualized for each person. According to this study by Anukum, they collected oral samples from 3 randomly selected females aged 56, 28, and 8 years. They extracted the DNA and amplified it, and they used the regions using custom barcoded primers before sequencing. And they're just talking about how they did the DNA studies. The study revealed that bacteria with varying diversities colonized the subjects on females at different age groups. So the study did study patients that were anywhere from 22 years old to 55 years old on that last study that I just mentioned. And so there was no distinction on their measurements made between age groups either. And this study is saying that microbiota does differ on different age groups. 27 sites, 9 healthy adults at microbiota on 4 occasions. These results indicate that the microbiota was personalized. In other words, all of us have a personalized microbiota. So finding out what is the ideal microbiota is not just going to be the same for everybody. So here's a simple question now, after going through that. Would you not want to test patients who are not using a mouth rinse if you were going to do this study? Is this study actually showing the other antibacterial rinses that they were using have no effect on nitric oxide and blood pressure? All right. I think it's reasonable to say that yes. The only thing that was different in that study as far as mouth rinses was those using the chlorhexidine had increased blood pressures, whereas the ones that used any other mouth rinse did not. That's what I saw. Okay, so the findings. No major correlations were found for any demographic or oral hygiene data except for tongue cleaning frequency. An R of 0.45 for correlation with tongue cleaning frequency was determined to be significant with a p-value of 0.03. That's like an ANOVA value. It's just a parameter for this determining significance. Subjects who clean their tongue twice or more per day as part of their normal oral hygiene were more likely to have an increased systolic blood pressure during use of chlorhexidine for 1 week. Okay, remember that. Wait a minute. Are they still using chlorhexidine? Yes. Yes, they are using chlorhexidine. Subjects who did not clean their tongue on a daily basis were more likely to have a decrease in systolic blood pressure. Now, let me just say that again. People that they studied in this study had an increase in systolic blood pressure when they cleaned their tongue and used chlorhexidine. But those who did not clean their tongue and used chlorhexidine, the blood pressure went down. Okay, simple question number 2. Was it the chlorhexidine or the tongue cleaning that raised the blood pressure? I mean, chlorhexidine used alone lowered the blood pressure on those not cleaning the tongue. And how did that study group explain that? Well, they didn't really. I'll tell you why. That's what they said. This is what they said. Those who did not clean the tongue had more ammonia-producing bacteria, and those who cleaned had more Neisseria. Those who did clean their tongue had more Neisseria flavescens, nitrate, and nitrite reductase producing bacteria, leading to actual nitric oxide production in the oral cavity. Therefore, they believe the ammonia-producing nitrite reductase producing bacteria steal nitrite away from the NO pathway. Well, okay, so what? So the ammonia producing bacteria steal nitrate away from the NO pathway. That tells me that, I mean, if you're going to use logic here, that would mean, well, okay, then they're going to produce less nitrite, and that should raise blood pressure. But no, they're saying that those who didn't clean their tongue with the tongue scraper and used chlorhexidine, the blood pressure went down. So this still doesn't explain that phenomena. The nitric oxide produced this way could be breathed into the lungs for benefit, they said. Well, okay, so what they're saying here is that they discovered in this study that not only is nitrite made in the mouth, which you swallow and goes into the bloodstream, but a little bit of actual nitric oxide is produced in the mouth. And it's absorbed through, well, maybe some from into the lungs. Well, only if you're a mouth breather. I mean, how could nitric oxide in the mouth go to the lungs if you're not a mouth breather? Okay. Well, okay. They didn't do a sleep study, so I'm just wondering about that statement. Mouth breathers would have an advantage here, I think, but they did not screen for sleep apnea. Okay. But the nice thing they did discover was in this study is that they did actually find a little nitric oxide in the mouth. Now they said it might be absorbed through the little crypts in the tongues and go directly into the bloodstream. Okay, that's great. But anyway, the bottom line is they did not explain why blood pressure went down. They didn't know. They did not. So this statement about ammonia producing nitrites does not explain the reduction in the blood pressure with chlorhexidine. They did not say those people who did not clean their tongue had higher blood pressures. They did say people are highly adaptable, and that's agreement. I agree with them. People are highly adaptable. I totally agree with them on that statement, and they agree with Brian and Lascalzo, 2011. Okay, more findings. Chlorhexidine mouthwash does not eradicate viable bacteria on the tongue. Now, this is their statement in this study on the chlorhexidine and the tongue scraper. And saying that chlorhexidine mouthwash does not eradicate the viable bacteria on the tongue, but instead causes a transient loss of viable counts, and the recovery from chlorhexidine treatment is associated with increased bacterial metabolic activity. In other words, that it enhanced the bacterial activity, okay, after they recovered. Differential abundance analysis identified significant changes in some species in response to treatment with chlorhexidine. In the 0 tongue cleaning group, 3 species had significant changes in abundance when they used chlorhexidine, while the 1 tongue cleaning per day cohort had 10 changes in bacteria, and the 2 tongue cleanings per day group had 12 taxonomic units of bacteria species changes. Okay, so tongue cleaning significantly affected how much chlorhexidine would attack the bacteria. The dynamic of the recovery of chlorhexidine exposures are notable in that there was a rapid recovery in viable counts between 6 to 8 hours, which corresponded with a significant increase in nitrite production and nitrate reduction to nitrite in the tongue samples and in richness of the bacterial flora. They're saying that the mouth rinse made things better. So are you wondering why such richness and recovery of bacteria on the tongue still produced higher blood pressure? And a product noted for some substantivity was used? I am too. These are big blows to those who believe in the scorched earth philosophy of mouth rinses. So these citations are the citations that were mentioned in that study that they used as precedents for some of the data and structure of that Texas study. Lundenberg and Govoni, and you'll see that there's about 7 of them here. So let's go through some more. Do changes in oral microbiota correlate with plasma nitrate response? That's one of the studies. A systematic review, and you can see that was from the Frontiers of Physiology, January 2021. 2 studies found no effect of mouthwashing on changes in plasma nitrates in this study. Bondono is the study that we're talking about. And Govoni, despite having found a marked attenuation after mouthwash, was noted that a significant rise in plasma nitrite occurred. Interestingly, this occurred despite the fact that nitrite formation in the mouth has been completely abolished by the intervention. So what they're saying in this study is that even though the mouth had a complete abolishment of commensal production of nitrite formation, there was still a marked attenuation. A significant plasma nitrite occurred. In other words, their blood nitrite went up while the mouth nitrite went down. Okay. So nitrites can be stored in the blood and tissues and used when there is a decreased endogenous production of nitric oxide. So Brian and Loscalzo in 2011 wrote that. And what they're saying there is that nitrites in the blood and tissues are there and bioavailable when another type of source of nitric oxide is decreased. In other words, the body compensates for losses in some areas and replaces it with production from another area. More from the systematic review are these statements. A total of 200 records were retrieved after application and search and strategy. After the first screening and duplicates were removed, 84 records were chosen for title and abstract evaluation. 14 studies resulting after this step were selected for full text examination. So what they're saying is there's just 14 studies on this subject of mouth rinses, lowering nitric oxide levels and raising blood pressures. The types of mouthwashes used in the studies were different. Nevertheless, all the studies contained chlorhexidine as one of the rinses that they studied. McDonough in 2015 found that Corsadil increased blood pressure while vademecum did not. So in this study, not all mouth rinses that were antibacterial raised blood pressure. And Corsadil is a chlorhexidine mouth rinse. Wassner in 2016 found that chlorhexidine and cepacol raised blood pressure, but Listerine did not. So in this study, Listerine did not cause a rise in blood pressure. These are more studies that are showing evidence that not all mouth rinses affect blood pressure or nitric oxide levels in the blood. And by the way, the Cepacol does have cetylpyridinium chloride. And what you need to know about cetylpyridinium chloride is this, that there are many mouth rinses out there with cetylpyridinium chloride in them. And here's a study, I don't have it listed on my slides here, but it's from Antimicrobial Effects of Cetylpyridinium Chloride Mouth Rinses by Franklin Garcia and Godoy. In this particular study, done at Tennessee, they evaluated 5 cetylpyridinium chloride mouth rinses. What they found was this: the formula on these rinses list the available cetylpyridinium chloride levels at 750, 700, and 700. All right, but the bioavailable cetylpyridinium chloride in these rinses that were measured by the experimenters showed a difference. For instance, Colgate Total CT 750 had a listed CPC level of 750, but the bioavailability of that rinse was 278. Whereas Crest Pro Health PGRM 700 was listed on the label, but they had 630 in the bioavailability of that rinse. So there was a 5-fold difference from anywhere from 92 with Colgate Total to 630 with Colgate Pro Health. So even though acetylpyridinium chloride has a listed CPC rating, the actual bioavailability of these rinses are vastly different depending on the flavorings and other ways that they make the rinse. Okay, so let's move on. There are a few articles on this subject. As I mentioned, 14. The N values were low on all the studies. In other words, they range anywhere from 36 person studies to 26, and some even less. Even experts have come to no conclusion on the effect of the disruption of microbiome on nitric oxide levels and blood pressure. Almost all articles show chlorhexidine is more problematic than other antimicrobial rinses, and other microbial rinses such as Listerine and Vatimecum showed no effect on blood pressure at all. And as I said before, one CPC rinse was shown to affect the blood pressure, and that was Cepacol, just the one that I know of so far. Like I said, I haven't read all of them, but it looks like I've read most of them from this short list. A few authors noted that the body can adapt to nitric oxide deficiency, as I said before, and long-term data gathering were not done in any of these studies. All the studies were short-term. As a matter of fact, in this Texas study, they did it for 7 days, rinsing with chlorhexidine and scraping the tongue. After that, the participants were allowed to go back to their regular mouth rinse that they were using before they started the study, and yet the bacteria grew back on the tongue and the blood pressures returned to normal within the next 7 days. Okay, so redundancy and pleiotropism exist in the nitric oxide pathway. No study on any rinse can be applied to another rinse in these studies. They must be studied separately. You cannot generalize from one study on a mouth rinse to another. You can't do it. Many rinses have substantivity such as cetylpyridinium chloride and chlorhexidine. A lot of rinses don't have substantivity. What that means is that the mouth rinses don't bind to the epithelium and last a long time, continually releasing product for a few hours afterward. They could be quite different from each other's and their effects also. Okay, so that comes from this study on sources of nitrates and nitrites in the physiological context of oral health. Now here's something more important coming up here, and we'll just go ahead and go to the next. Now, about mouth rinses balancing your microbiome. On this study done in England at Leeds University, they make this statement. They say that mouth rinses can be used to balance our microbiome. Rather than being a scorched earth advocate, this author says, in this way, they may have a more selective mode of action in which they mainly inhibit the growth and metabolism of organisms implicated in disease, while leaving those associated with oral health relatively unaffected. And next thing they say is this: unlike the principles behind antibiotic therapy, oral care products could function prophylactically to stabilize the normal oral microbiota. And I agree with that. It stabilizes the the normal oral microbiota. Okay. So let's close. In the centerpiece article from the Frontier, there were no exclusions for participants already using antimicrobial rinses every day. In this article, tongue cleaning was more than the rinse was on blood pressure problems and nitric oxide levels. In this article, paradoxical results for lowered the blood pressure was not adequately explained. In other words, that rinse on people who didn't scrape their tongue actually got lower blood pressures, and it was never explained. No control on antibacterial toothpaste were even considered in this study, such as triclosan toothpaste that was later removed from the market in February 2019. No consideration as to hydrogen sulfide of lowering blood pressure was considered. I just threw a monkey wrench in there. Many of you don't know that hydrogen sulfide, which is a bad breath gas, can lower blood pressure. Put that into your brain and think about it a little bit. Now, hydrogen sulfide is made in many parts of the body, so whether mouth rinses has any effect on it at all, it has no effect like nitric oxide commensal bacteria do. Not that I know of anyway. So we're going to talk about this particular author. Hi, Dan. More closing facts. No one is talking about viruses and microbiome balance either. Okay, everybody's talking about bacteria, but nobody talks about viruses and yeast in these microbiomes as part of the normal oral flora that they all think is such an important thing. In this study, bacterial infected viruses in the gut microbiome, or called phages actually, are linked to cognition. Nasal breathing lowered the increase in blood pressure during exercise. Also, in another study here, nasal breathing lowered the increase in blood pressure during exercise with nasal dilators in. So we've talked about nasal dilators. Dr. Skinner talked about nasal dilators and how they improve our nasal breathing. They don't know why for sure. It could be just increasing the volume of air that goes through the nose. I think it's because nitric oxide is released more, just my opinion. In the first study that I'm showing here, viruses can actually, certain viruses can increase your cognitive ability, your ability to think, and other viruses can make you a worse ability to think with cognition. All right. While only an association and not a cause and effect link was established, the findings suggest that about 50% of adults could have undetected high blood pressure due to gum disease, a tissue infection that also can lead to inflammation and bone loss. In other words, gum disease itself can raise blood pressure. Another reason why we like to control it with good oral hygiene. Okay. And then in a recent company online discussion, oops, I spelled that wrong. It's just a little typo there. They said they can actually target one bacteria. This particular study comes from a company called, I'll just show it to you here, Keystone Bio. Okay, I'm going to go back here. Keystone Bio. And the author or the head of that company was on a webinar on the internet, and I had a little micro debate with this scientist because I was telling him that bacteria, he says, has no value. I believe is wrong, and that what we do not know is that they may be needed. So those who enter the brave new world of having the ability to actually determine what microbiome balance can be present are actually entering a scary world, in my opinion. The microbiome has both pleiotropic and redundant aspects, just as does the cytokine system and the nitric oxide system. This means a plaque of a mixture of microbiomes, including yeast and viruses, and proportions for them may do the same thing, another plaque with a different mixture of proportions and types of bacteria and viruses. And it may turn virulent depending on the environment or the health of the person, the host, or the genetics of the host, and different proportions of the mixture. So I'm just going to read that. I'm just going to say that another way. You could have a totally different microbiome mix as another person and still have the good effects from that microbiome that are doing the same things that another completely different mixture in another person has. We talked about people having their own personal microbiome, and it's true. Those who think they can take one bacteria out, like this author did on this company, I think are making a mistake. He said that P. gingivalis was completely worthless bacteria, that in other words, it should never be in our body, that it has no value whatsoever. I don't necessarily agree that. I know that P. gingivalis has a lot of problems causing a red bacteria organization, but they all work together. And sometimes P. gingivalis by itself has no deleterious effect at all. And we don't even know that it might have a good effect in some place in our body. To say that we can eliminate one bacteria and completely eliminate it from our body, I'm not so sure it's such a good idea. We also note that the alternative sources of nitric oxide play in each individual. We further note that not all subjects require high concentration of nitric oxide forming nitrite to achieve a healthy blood pressure. 5 subjects in quadrant 2 have NO-forming reductase at low levels, but have a resting systolic of under 110. We predict that these subjects were producing sufficient endogenous nitric oxide. And here's the big part. And they have other blood pressure regulating mechanisms in place that bacteria, and that they are bacterial nitric oxide independent, okay? That those other blood pressure sources of regulation are not dependent on bacterial nitrogen production. And that's from the same Texas study. I agree with them on that. So what we should be saying? Antimicrobial rinses can balance the oral flora. We found that from both the Texas study and also the English study in Leeds. Good oral hygiene includes mouth rinsing and generally good hygiene practices. Mouth rinses are not all the same. There are more studies supporting their benefits than negative side effects. And even mouth rinses with the same formula can be quite different. Periodontal disease raises blood pressure. Chlorhexidine has more negative side effects than any other mouth rinse, in my opinion. People should not repeat inflammatory interpretations and study results without reading what they actually say. The scorched earth statements about mouth rinses are irresponsible and reckless. Hardly anyone is mentioning viruses and yeast in global statements on oral microbiome. They're just not talking about it. Planktonic flora, biofilm flora are different. So planktonic flora and biofilm flora are different. Tongue scraping creates a planktonic-like flora that reacts differently to rinses. So that's pretty much the end of my discussion. I hope this will allow you to speak more intelligently on this subject to others. I don't know all the answers, but I do think that this should help you understand better how to speak about the subject when it's brought up in the future. So now, if you want to speak to me in the future or want to look at some of the products that the company, Sleep Balance Academy, offers to air participants, then you can just go to this site and look at the products. I would suggest you go ahead and grab that code there, and it'll take you to my website. Thank you very much.